Hi everyone, it's Mr. Perry back with another selection from Great Expectations. I've got a new copy this time. I wanted to read another selection that I think is important but maybe a little confusing, and that's the scene that follows the chapter in which Pip has just come back from Miss Havisham's, or he's just gone to Miss Havisham's and come back. So to refresh your memory, Miss Havisham's was a pretty weird experience for Pip. In addition to her being kind of creepy herself, there's also Estella that he encounters, and she treats him with condescension. He calls her proud. Miss Havisham keeps trying to get him to say how pretty she is. And clearly there's something going on there that Pip doesn't understand. He doesn't understand the weird, creepy old house with the defunct brewery and the strange vision of Miss Havisham hanging in the outside space. So he's pretty freaked out. And he comes back home and he's accosted by Mr. Pumblechook, who we're getting to know is just a complete fake. And his sister, who of course is interested in advancing the family's financial interests, and so is interested in why a rich person like Miss Havisham would be inviting Pip to come play. So I'm in chapter 9, and let's see what happens. When I reached home, my sister was very curious to know all about Miss Havisham's and asked a number of questions. And I soon found myself getting heavily bumped from behind in the nape of the neck and the small of the back, and having my face ignominiously shoved against the kitchen wall because I did not answer these questions at sufficient length. If a dread of not being understood be hidden in the breasts of other young people to anything like the extent to which it used to be hidden in mine, which I consider probable, as I have no particular reason to suspect myself of having been a monstrosity, it is the key to many reservations. So, this sentence, let's just stop there for a minute. This is a very Dickensian sentence, and it's typical of writers from this time period, and a few writers today. It's long, there's lots of dependent clauses, but he says a lot of kind of fun things in there. First of all, he says that he dreads not being understood, which I think pretty much anybody can appreciate. We all are afraid sometimes that the people we're trying to explain things to won't understand us, especially if, like in this case, we don't really understand the thing we're trying to explain ourselves. And when he says he has no reason to think that he was a monstrosity, all he means is he didn't think he was exceptional. Like, he's just a normal person, and his feelings would be similar to anybody's, which is, you know, true, and that's why he's one of the all-time great characters. I felt convinced that if I described Miss Havisham's as my eyes had seen it, I should not be understood. Not only that, but I felt convinced that Miss Havisham, too, would not be understood, and although she was perfectly incomprehensible to me, I entertained an impression that there would be something coarse and treacherous in my dragging her, as she really was, to say nothing of Miss Estella, before the contemplation of Mrs. Joe. Consequently, I said as little as I could, and had my face shoved against the kitchen wall. So, he doesn't think, even if he actually tried to explain what it was like at Miss Havisham's, that he would be able to, and they would have no idea what he was talking about, and he might say something accidentally negative about her and about Estella, who you can probably tell he has a little bit of a crush on already. And as a result, Mrs. Joe beats him again. She, as we've seen, is quite abusive. The worst of it was that bullying old Pumblechook, preyed upon by a devouring curiosity to be informed of all I had seen and heard, came gaping over in his chaise cart at tea time to have the details divulged to him. And the mere sight of the torment, with his fishy eyes and mouth open, his sandy hair inquisitively on end, and his waistcoat heaving with windy arithmetic, made me vicious in my reticence. Okay, you're probably wondering what the heck he's saying. So Mr. Pumblechook is basically like one of those guys who acts like he knows it all and wants to get a lot of attention for knowing it all, even though he really knows nothing and he's just kind of a windbag. And Pip's words here are chosen purposefully fishy eyes and mouth open to make him seem like he's kind of this creeping fish, down inside a mucky pond. His sandy hair inquisitively on end, so he's just kind of disheveled and strange looking. And his waistcoat heaving with windy arithmetic. You might remember that one of the ways he kind of fills time when he's with Pip is to just like throw math problems at him. And Pip doesn't appreciate that, obviously, because it kind of puts him on the spot and just makes him feel dumb. And it really has no purpose, because Pumblechook doesn't care at all about Pip's math ability. It just is something he thinks an adult should do and makes him look good and makes him look smart. "Well, boy," Uncle Pumblechook began as soon as he was seated in the chair of honor by the fire, "how did you get on uptown?" I answered, "Pretty well, sir," and my sister shook her fist at me. "Pretty well," Mr. Pumblechook repeated. "Pretty well is no answer. Tell us what you mean by pretty well, boy." Whitewash on the forehead hardens the brain into a state of obstinacy, perhaps. Anyhow, with whitewash from the wall on my forehead, my obstinacy was adamantine. I reflected for some time, and then answered as if I had discovered a new idea. "I mean, pretty well." What is he talking about? So, Mrs. Joe, his sister, has banged him into the wall. So he's got, like, plaster on his forehead, because she banged him pretty hard. And he's sort of being sarcastic here, like, if you have been banged into the wall for not doing something that is kind of unreasonable to ask you to do anyway, then you're just going to get more stubborn. That's what obstinacy is. Adamantine means like a hard jewel. So, very stubborn. My sister, with an exclamation of impatience, was going to fly at me. I had no shadow of defense, for Joe was busy in the forge, when Mr. Pumblechook interposed with, "No, don't lose your temper. Leave this lad to me, ma'am. Leave this lad to me." Mr. Pumblechook then turned me towards him as if he were going to cut my hair and said, "First, to get our thoughts in order, 43 pence?" I calculated the consequences of replying £400, and finding them against me, went as near the answer as I could, which was somewhere about 8 pence off. Now, this is a clever phrasing of Dickens. Mr. Pumblechook is clearly asking him to do some sort of math problem involving money, and instead of calculating the response, he calculates the consequences of replying with a ridiculous answer. So it's a little bit of a pun. Mr. Pumblechook then put me through my pence table from 12 pence make 1 shilling up to 40 pence make 3 and 4 pence, and then triumphantly demanded, as if he had done for me, "Now, how much is 43 pence?" To which I replied, after a long interval of reflection, "I don't know." And I was so aggravated that I almost doubt if I did know. Mr. Pumblechook worked his head like a screw to screw it out of me, and said, "Is 43 pence 7 and 6 pence 3 fardens, for instance?" "Yes," said I. And although my sister instantly boxed my ears, it was highly gratifying to me to see that the answer spoiled his joke, and brought him to a dead stop. "Boy, what is this? What like is Miss Havisham?" Mr. Pumblechook began again when he had recovered, folding his arms tight on his chest and applying the screw. Dickens likes to keep these metaphors going throughout a scene, so Mr. Pumblechook is acting kind of like a screwdriver trying to screw this answer out of Pip. "Very tall and dark," I told him. "Is she, uncle?" asked my sister. Mr. Pumblechook winked assent, from which I at once inferred that he had never seen Miss Havisham, for she was nothing of the kind. So Pip is exposing to us how Mr. Pumblechook is just full of bull. "Good," said Mr. Pumblechook conceitedly. "This is the way to have him. We are beginning to hold our own, I think, Mum." "I am sure, uncle," returned Mrs. Joe. "I wish you had him always. You know so well how to deal with him." "Now, boy, what was she a-doing of when you went in today?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "She was sitting," I answered, "in a black velvet coach." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another, as they well might, and both repeated, "In a black velvet coach?" "Yes," said I, "and Miss Estella, that's her niece, I think, handed her in cake and wine at the coach window on a gold plate. And we all had cake and wine on gold plates, and I got up behind the coach to eat mine because she told me to." "Was anybody else there?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "4 dogs," said I. "Large or small?" "Immense," said I. "And they fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another again in utter amazement. I was perfectly frantic, a reckless witness under the torture, and would have told them anything. So we know, because we remember the scene from Miss Havisham's, that none of this happened. Like, what Pip is describing is completely made up. And he's making the analogy that he's like a witness in a crime or a legal suit who's being tortured to reveal secrets. Where was this coach? Oh, sorry. Where was this coach, in the name of gracious? Asked my sister. In Miss Havisham's room. They stared again. But there weren't any horses to it. I added this saving clause in the moment of rejecting 4 richly comparisoned coursers, which I had wild thoughts of harnessing. Coursers are like horses. And by harnessing them, again, he's making sort of a clever joke here. He's harnessing them in his imagination and harnessing them for the purposes of the story, but he decided not to, because that would have been just a little bit too much, because it'd be weird to have 4 horses in, like, a living room. Can this be possible, Uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. What can the boy mean? I'll tell you, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook. My opinion is it's a sedan chair. She's flighty, you know, very flighty, quite flighty enough to pass her days in a sedan chair. Did you ever see her in it, Uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. How could I? He returned, forced to the admission, when I never see her in my life. Never clapped eyes on her. Goodness, Uncle, and yet you have spoken to her? Why, don't you know, said Mr. Pumblechook testily, that when I have been there, I have been took up to the outside of her door, and the door was stood ajar, and she has spoken to me that way. Don't say you don't know that, Mum. Howsoever the boy went there to play, what did you play at, boy? We played with flags, I said. I beg to observe that I think of myself with amazement when I recall the lies I told on this occasion. Flags, echoed my sister. Yes, said I. Estella waved a blue flag, and I waved a red one, and Miss Havisham waved one sprinkled all over with little gold stars out at the coach window. And then we all waved our swords and hurrahed. Swords, repeated my sister. Where did you get swords from? Out of a cupboard, said I. And I saw pistols in it, and jam, and pills, and there was no daylight in the room, but it was all lighted up with candles. That's true, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook, with a grave nod. That's the state of the case, for that much I have seen myself. And then they both stared at me, and I, with an obtrusive show of artlessness on my countenance, stared at them and plaited the right leg of my trousers with my right hand. Artlessness, by the way, is like innocence or naivete. If they'd asked me any more questions, I should undoubtedly have betrayed myself, meaning shown that he was lying. For I was even then on the point of mentioning that there was a balloon in the yard, and should have hazarded the statement but for my invention being divided between that phenomenon and a bear in the brewery. They were so much occupied, however, in discussing the marvels I had already presented for their consideration that I escaped. The subject still held them when Joe came in from his work to have a cup of tea, to whom my sister, more for the relief of her own mind than for the gratification of his, related my pretended experiences. So this part about the balloon in the yard and the bear in the brewery, these are other inventions that he was thinking of adding to his story, but he didn't have to go into those crazy scenes because they stopped asking him questions. Now, when I saw Joe open his blue eyes and roll them all around the kitchen in helpless amazement, I was overtaken by penitence, meaning he felt guilty. But only as regarded him, not in the least as regarded the other two. Towards Joe, and Joe only, I considered myself a young monster, while they sat debating what results would come to me from Miss Havisham's acquaintance and favor. See, Mrs. Joe and Mr. Pumblechook are all they care about is getting something, money or influence or connections or something from Miss Havisham. They don't care about Pip at all. And that's why he doesn't feel guilty about lying to them. They had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property, meaning money. Mr. Pumblechook was in favor of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade. Say, the corn and seed trade, for instance, which is what he does. Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets. If a fool's head can't express better opinions than that, said my sister, and you have got any work to do, you had better go and do it. So he went. After Mr. Pumblechook had driven off, and when my sister was washing up, I stole into the forge to Joe, and remained by him until he had done for the night. Then I said, Before the fire goes out, Joe, I should like to tell you something. Should you, Pip? said Joe, drawing his shoeing stool near the forge. Then tell us, what is it, Pip? Joe, said I, taking hold of his rolled-up shirt sleeve and twisting it between my finger and thumb, you remember all that about Miss Havisham's? Remember, said Joe. I believe you. Wonderful. It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true. Well, what are you telling of, Pip? Cried Joe, falling back in the greatest amazement. You don't mean to say it's... Yes, I do, Joe. It's lies, Joe. But not all of it. Why, sure you don't mean to say, Pip, that there was no black velvet coach. For I stood shaking my head. But at least there was dogs, Pip. Come, Pip, said Joe persuasively. If there weren't no wheel cutlets, at least there was dogs. No, Joe. A dog? Said Joe. A puppy? Come. No, Joe, there was nothing at all of the kind. As I fixed my eyes hopelessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fellow, I say. Where do you expect to go? It's terrible, Joe, ain't it? Terrible? Cried Joe. Awful. What possessed you? I don't know what possessed me, Joe, I replied, letting his shirt sleeve go and sitting down in the ashes at his feet, hanging my head. But I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick, nor my hands so coarse. So remember, this is a reference back to Estella's and Miss Havisham's not so subtle implications that Pip is very unsophisticated. They basically made him feel ashamed for anything that didn't fit in with their more genteel, sophisticated way of living. And so that's this major turning point in the book where he comes back from Miss Havisham's the first time, feeling completely ashamed of not only himself, but of Joe and his living situation too, which is this thing that kind of eats at him throughout the book. And then I told Joe that I felt very miserable and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's who was dreadfully proud, and that she had said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of it somehow, though I didn't know how. This was a case of metaphysics, at least as difficult for Joe to deal with as for me. Metaphysics means like psychology or philosophy. It's something kind of hard to figure out, especially if you're a little kid. But Joe took the case altogether out of the region of metaphysics, and by that means vanquished it, meaning he made it more tangible, more real life, and able to be dealt with. There's one thing you may be sure of, Pip, said Joe after some rumination, namely, that lies is lies. Howsoever they come, they did not to come, and they come from the father of lies, meaning Satan, and work round to the same. Don't you tell me no more of 'em, Pip. That ain't the way to get out of being common, old chap. And as to being common, I don't make it out at all clear. You are uncommon in some things, you're uncommon small, likewise you're an uncommon scholar. No, I am ignorant and backward, Joe. Why, see what a letter you wrote last night. Wrote in print, even. I've seen letters, from gentlefolks that I'll swear weren't wrote in print, said Joe. So here is Joe being the philosopher. He's obviously not educated, and he's fairly simple and gullible, but he's also gets kind of straight to the truth of things sometimes. And this is a situation where he's pointing out to Pip that, something kind of reasonable, that, okay, you're common, or in other words, sort of unsophisticated in some things, but you're uncommon, or more sophisticated and skilled at other things. I have learnt next to nothing, Joe. You think much of me, it's only that. Well, Pip, said Joe, be it so or be it so'n't, you must be a common scholar afore you can be an uncommon one, I should hope. The king upon his throne, with his crown upon his head, can't sit and write his acts of parliament in print without having begun when he were unpromoted prince with the alphabet. Ah, added Joe with a shake of the head that was full of meaning, and begun at A, too, and worked his way to Z, and I know what that is to do, though I can't say I've exactly done it. So he's trying to cheer Pip up. But again, he makes a good point. Like, you got to start somewhere, and then you eventually get there. You can't all of a sudden be good at something, or you can't all of a sudden, change who you are. And these lessons that Joe is trying to convey to Pip in this conversation, again, are something that sort of carry throughout the book. I see that I'm running out of time here on the video, so I'm going to skip ahead to the last paragraph of chapter 9. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. This is one of the most quoted passages from Great Expectations, and really could apply to almost any book, and as the narrator, older Pip, points out, to any life. We all have incredibly momentous occurrences, some of them accidental or coincidental, others based on intentional decisions we made, but especially for kids, things that just happen to them without any choice of their own, that just set the rest of life, or the rest of the book, or the rest of the movie, in motion. And the narrator asks you to think about your own life and think about if there are any days like that. So you should see if there's something kind of like this that you can look back on and say, oh, yeah, if you struck that day out, or if you took that day out of my life, I really wouldn't be who I am, or things would be totally different. For me, it's a day when I happened to be walking across the University of Michigan campus, and I met the woman who would become my wife, and eventually we moved to California. Eventually we got divorced, but I stayed in California. I met a new lovely person and got married to her, and here I am. So it's like, without that chance occurrence on the campus, I never would have ended up here, and I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, and I wouldn't be reading Great Expectations to you. So, we all have days like that, and maybe you're not old enough to have had too many of them. But anyway, see if you can think of something like that, and in that way, kind of feel like you're having a parallel experience to Pip. So I'm almost out of time on my phone. Hopefully that helped. I'll try and do a few more of these throughout the book in places that I think would be useful to read together, and I'll see you soon.